The Supreme Court recently denied a stay that would have protected a state's Second Amendment sanctuary law, but now that same issue is back in front of the Supreme Court for a final resolution. So let's talk about what is happening. So like I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about a significant Second Amendment case that is once again back in front of the Supreme Court. This case is dealing with a state's Second Amendment Preservation Act, which we've discussed in the past. We've talked about this case because essentially the Supreme Court issued an order originally denying a state that would have protected the state of Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act, also known as SAPA. After that denial order, this case was then sent back down to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, who recently issued their decision in this case. The 8th Circuit has sided with the Biden administration and decided that the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act is invalid because, in their opinion, the state law invalidated federal laws in violation of the Supremacy Clause. This now sets up a very important battle about a state's sanctuary laws, and this is an issue heading back to the Supreme Court. And one of the interesting things also about this is with the administration change, with Trump taking office, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they decide they want to contest this going forward, or whether or not they're going to allow Missouri to actually keep their Second Amendment Preservation Act. Now, for some context, back in 2021, Missouri passed a law called the Second Amendment Preservation Act. That law set the state's interpretation of the Second Amendment and also set restrictions on the support and funding that a state would provide to federal agencies in their attempt to enforce federal laws that would violate the Second Amendment. Very important for this structure of the law, it also created a civil remedy where anyone could actually sue a Missouri official if that Missouri official actually helped to enforce federal laws or gave assistance to a federal agent, and the result of that was a violation of the Second Amendment. Now, this Missouri law is similar in nature to the Texas abortion law known as SB 8 that was recently up at the Supreme Court level, and in a prior term, the Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called Whole Women's Health. With both the Texas law and the Missouri law and how they're structured, you can't really get an umbrella injunction against the state and also the state attorney general, since those are not the ones actually enforcing the law. Instead, the injunction would have to be against each individual resident who brings a civil remedy against that officer or agent. And then even if you got it against one individual, another person can pop up bringing a civil suit, and goes on and on and on. So it's kind of structured in a way to frustrate these umbrella injunctions in stopping the entire law. Now, in this Missouri case, the District Court on review ruled in favor of the Biden administration, striking down the Missouri Preservation Act in its entirety. Now, in response, the state of Missouri then appealed up to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. Missouri also asked for the 8th Circuit to issue a stay on the lower court decision while the 8th Circuit was reviewing this appeal. However, the 8th Circuit denied that request for a stay. That then led Missouri for the first time to go to the Supreme Court on an emergency application, and they wanted the Supreme Court to grant an emergency stay. However, on review, the Supreme Court issued an 8-1 order denying that request for an emergency stay. Only Justice Thomas was the one in favor of granting the stay in favor of Missouri and allowing them to keep their Second Amendment Preservation Act in force and effect during the appeal. Now, after this Supreme Court denial, the case then went back down to the 8th Circuit, who held expedited arguments in this case. And in the case, Missouri made multiple arguments, including that the federal government does not have standing to actually bring this suit. The federal government is suing the state of Missouri and the Attorney General of Missouri. But again, as I mentioned, the statute only allows private individuals to enforce the law. Therefore, the argument was that there was no proper defendant, and essentially they were suing the wrong people. They also argued that the United States government could not identify any single act that the state of Missouri committed or that any of its officers or agents committed that actually harmed the federal government. It also went on to say that shows that there's no standing, there has been no harm, and therefore this lawsuit should be thrown out. As a result of this, we then got a decision from the 8th Circuit, a 3-judge panel, and ultimately they ruled in favor of the Biden administration. The 8th Circuit found that the Missouri Second Amendment Preservation Act invalidates federal laws, and because of that, it was a violation of the Supremacy Clause. And based on that, the 8th Circuit panel upheld the lower court's motion for summary judgment, and ultimately they found that the SAPA law in Missouri could be fully enjoined. In the decision, the 8th Circuit focused a lot on whether or not the federal government has standing to actually sue Missouri over the SAPA law. First, on this whole standing question, the 8th Circuit looked at whether the federal government has suffered an injury because of the Missouri law. the Eighth Circuit actually found that yes, they believe the federal government has suffered an injury. They stated that Missouri argues that the federal government's interest is not legally protected because the United States is not entitled to the state's assistance with the enforcement of federal law. That argument confuses standing with the merits of the dispute. To say that the United States was injured by the withdrawal of state assistance is not to say that it is entitled to that assistance. Interference with the federal government's interest in enforcing federal law is sufficient to establish that the act's implementation injured the United States. So the Eighth Circuit agreed that the federal government is not entitled to state assistance or help, but then they also found that a state pulling assistance does cause an injury to the federal government. The Eighth Circuit then went on to reject the arguments that the relief in this case would be insufficient since only private individuals can enforce the law. The Eighth Circuit found that the state officials play some role in this structure of the law, and the role that they found that they actually play is refraining from enforcing certain federal laws. So essentially, the Eighth Circuit found that not acting on a law is acting on a law, and that's how the state and its officials are actually involved in the structure of the SAPA law. And based on that, they upheld the lower court's decision, which struck down Missouri's SAPA law entirely. But now, after that decision, the Attorney General Andrew Bailey out of Missouri, friend of the channel, I've had the opportunity to speak with him and his people multiple times. He is actually seeking Supreme Court review of this ruling. Originally, this petition for Supreme Court review would have been due back in late November, but Missouri and the Attorney General requested an extension based on the importance of this specific case, and then also the workload of some other important cases that were being appealed up to higher courts. And they were already litigating multiple very important cases like the student loan challenges, censorship lawsuits, so they got an extension from the Supreme Court. Now, in this request, the state of Missouri argues that the Eighth Circuit also concluded that the United States had standing to bring this suit against the state, its governor, and its attorney general, even though the law at issue is enforced only by private parties. This is the same threshold standing issue the Fifth Circuit rejected when the United States sued Texas over its abortion laws. This court granted certiorari in that case, but then dismissed the appeal without deciding that issue. This case thus addresses 1. Whether the United States has standing to enjoin a Missouri statute that is enforced only by private parties, and only against local state political entities, not the United States. And 2, whether the federal courts may second guess the reasons that states decide to exercise their authority under the 10th Amendment. So here Missouri is hinting at the fact that this Missouri SAPA law in this case deals with a very similar issue that the Supreme Court found intriguing before and granted review in a case, the Texas abortion law, the SB 8 law before, but they ended up ruling on a different issue. They allude to the fact that this would be another perfect opportunity for the Supreme Court to resolve that issue that they took before but didn't resolve. So a huge Second Amendment sanctuary law case, which is on a final merits, will now be once again back in front of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is familiar with this issue because of the emergency application, because of the order they issued on it prior. So in some ways, they're familiar with this. Again, it's on a final merits. It's dealing with a conflict between the federal government and the state government and how they want to enforce certain Second Amendment laws. Now, this is also interesting because the dynamic of the Biden administration now being out and Trump and his administration taking control. So it's going to be interesting to see, what does the Trump administration do with this? Do they even contest it going forward? If there is a petition Supreme Court, maybe Trump says like, hey, we're not going to contest this. We think Missouri is right. They have the right to defend their interpretation of the Second Amendment or pull their funding from federal agents who are trying to enforce inconsistent federal laws, which violate the Second Amendment. So very interesting, a lot of moving parts right now, but this is heading back in front of the Supreme Court. So as things develop, I will let you guys know. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.